Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Joseph S. Samiego, the author of the Columbian Age fantasy book series, and I am back with another historian reaction video. This one is on the Maya, the Aztec, and Inca, and is brought to us by Overly Sarcastic Productions. I will link the original video in the description. I was recommended to watch more of these, that I would enjoy them, and I've watched a couple, and yeah, they've been pretty good. I kind of like their style, so I want to watch this one. I haven't seen it yet. I know a good amount about these three cultures, more Aztec and Maya than the Inca. My family being, my mother's family being Mexican, it, kind of gave me an interest in learning about the cultures that were there pre-Columbian years. So let's get into this and see what they got to say.
Alrighty, let's cover the great civilizations of the New World, from the time before the Old World made the New World new by killing most of the New World and reconstructing it to be way more Old Worldy. Yeah, that's a mouthful. Anyway, three great...
Yeah, so that was a mouthful. And yeah, a lot of it was, a lot of this is great civilizations. And that's one reason I really did want to look at this too, is because there has been some scholars that have said in recent years and going back, a long time actually, that the great civilizations of the world were in places like Europe and in the Mediterranean, that there were no great civilizations here in the Western Hemisphere, what is now the Americas, Central America, South America, and even in North America. And that is simply not true. We know for a fact that the Aztec, Maya, Inca, Nazca, Mississippian, Olmec, these are great civilizations and that are on par with others throughout the world. But then even if you look at the dynamics of other cultures like the Taino, the Cherokee, the Iroquois Confederacy, you go even further around, Toltec, you see greatness in these civilizations as well, in these cultures. So it's just simply not true that the only great civilizations were centered around the Mediterranean. All right, off my soapbox.
Civilizations: the Inca, the Aztec, and the Maya. The Maya, right. The Inca, and the Aztec? Okay. Aztec, Maya, Inca?
Yep.
Hey, nice. Okay, next problem. What's the difference between them?
Whole world.
Because before I started researching this video, I honestly couldn't tell you either, because so often their stories are only told insofar as they relate to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. So we hear a lot about human sacrifices and smallpox, but not so much anything else, and they all kind of blend together. But these...
And that's a common thread that you'll see from a lot of the history that was written, starting with the Columbian Exchange up until even in the early parts of the 20th century, is that these were all just, indigenous people. That's it. It was just one group. And we know that not to be the case, that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of independent cultures of these indigenous groups throughout the Western Hemisphere. And this is just a simple case, not a simple case, excuse me. This is just a basic idea that has happened of history is written by the victors. We know history because of the conquerors telling their side of the story. And that is what this is. The Aztecs sacrificed a lot of people, and the Mayans sacrificed a lot of people because, and that's what they saw. So they had to be put, they had to be taught differently. And the only way to teach them differently is through conquest. And they just don't know because they haven't accepted Christ and all these things. Well, we know for a fact that these cultures were very well established through trade, economics, diplomacy, even military, religious practices. They were not these backwards people that they were portrayed to be, but it gave a justification to the conquerors, so that people back home would not think that the conquerors were really the bad guys, but they were. The conquerors were the bad guys. And it even kind of came out in this for the British and other Europeans later on, even to conquer America, and even for Americans, the United States citizens, to expand westward. these indigenous peoples are not using their land properly, so we have to show them how to really use this land to the full extent. And what they were doing was basically the indigenous had this practice they've been using for thousands of years on land and cultivating land, and the European settlers wanted to show them how to fuck it up like they had done in Europe, because that's basically what happened in Europe, is that they deforested a lot of the land. The land was going bad, and they were overpopulated, so they had to spread out more, and they came here. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the just a lot of propaganda to justify actions and to expand.
Societies were highly complex and had their own histories long before the conquistadors showed up, and they were also completely unique and distinct from each other. The Maya have been around on the Yucatan Peninsula for basically ever and were subsistence farmers for almost the whole time, but their great cities mostly disappeared before the Spanish ever arrived.
And the Mayan had a great way of cultivating their land because of the cenotes, which are basically these wells that are sinkholes filled with water, and they were able to, and part of it was they can link these cities with the cenotes and with the land, and these were also places that were revered as being portals to the underworld. So they were pretty cool in that aspect too.
The Aztec Empire was born from a triple alliance of city-states in central Mexico, and they built up an amazing capital city in Tenochtitlan. Unlike the Maya, the Aztecs only...
So even here, the painting shows blood coming down the steps of the temples, and so even there, they're showing you this looks like art that would have probably been done by somebody recreating a Spanish tale.
Only lasted for about 100 years before the Spanish wiped them out. And finally...
But they built the city on a freaking lake. How ingenious is that? I mean, seriously, that's you have to have a high level of intelligence to be able to do that and build a city that rivaled London on a lake.
The Inca were from South America, not Mexico, and they lived almost entirely in the western coastal mountains for over a century before the Spanish showed up. So we're dealing with a decent amount of variety here, and it's part of what makes it really cool. So before we jump into this, we should also take a look at what sources we're working with. Archaeology in most cases is pretty good, but in this specific instance, we're also lucky enough to have decent written accounts. The Maya and the Aztecs both had pictographic writing, although it took us a good long while before we could actually translate any of it. First, we figured out numbers in the Mayan calendar, and then in the mid and late 1900s, we were...
Now, I have to double check, but that looks like the Aztec calendar. The Aztec calendar was actually inspired by the Mayan calendar. They had a lot of similarities. Their look was a little different. I remember seeing one that did have... because that looks like Quetzalcoatl, actually. But I do remember seeing one that did have the deity with his tongue sticking out in the middle, but I always thought it was more of a different look. So I'm going to research that. And that's a common thing that you'll find, is that they use the Aztec calendar to show the Mayan calendar. It happened a lot during 2012 when everybody's like, oh my God, the world's going to end. The Mayans said it. They always show them the Aztec calendar. It's very common. The Aztec calendar and the Mayan calendar both have these two, more or less two calendars in one. One is for religious practices, which is a 13-month calendar, and the other is 13-month calendar with 20 days, so it's less days, more or less. And they each also had the full 365 calendar. And I don't know what they did for leap year and all that crap, but instead of having it broken down into centuries, they had it broken down as cycles, or the long count, which was a 50 or 52 year segment. And as the cycles ended, that's when a new world would begin, more or less, in their mind. And a lot of it wasn't like, oh, we're going to have a new world here, but it's more of a new world. It's almost just like, yeah, new century. So we went into 1999, I'm there partying with my buds, senior in high school, and then 2000, yay, new century, new time, and it was very similar aspect. It was a time of celebration, and the really big days for a lot of cultures throughout the world, actually, though, was the solstices. So that was really more important that was really the starts of the years. And yeah, we do have a lot of written documentation from the Aztec and the Mayan because of the fact that they did do a lot of the pictograph, graphic writing, similar to hieroglyphics. And we have been able to find archaeological evidence of translatable sources, which is really cool. Kind of like the Rosetta Stone in Egypt, very similar idea for the Mayan. And that's what's been really cool. And there's people that have been working for almost half a century in one location because there's just so much in just one location that it's and that gets buried by the jungle. The jungle reclaims it. So the world will always reclaim. And that's one of the ideas behind the Mayan culture too, was that that nature and the world will always come back to reclaim everything. So, and they saw that daily with the jungle.
Able to translate more of the Maya script and discover that their writing system was syllabic rather than alphabetic. And lucky for us, it turns out that a lot of the texts contain dynastic records, so the Maya actually recorded their own history, which is really cool. The reason we still have a lot of Mayan writing is because a lot of it was written on surfaces like temple walls, ceramics, and the occasional staircase. The Aztec writing system is a trickier topic though, since the Aztecs weren't quite around for long enough to create a fully fleshed out writing system. From the surviving codices we have, we know that they certainly liked writing, but I say surviving because Spanish Christians burned almost all of their texts before incidentally also murdering almost everybody. Which, by the way, anyone in any situation who decides that burning information is a good idea is just being a dick. There's no two ways about that. Luckily, we still know a decent amount about the Aztecs on account of Spanish writings about them.
Yeah, so the idea that when the Spanish came here, they did destroy a lot of the, documentate, a lot of the text. They would destroy a lot of the culture because they wanted the conquered people to embrace and assimilate their culture. So they destroyed the remnants of the indigenous cultures, which is a heinous act because you're basically erasing them and turn them into something else. And it happened with the Native American schools, indigenous schools. I try not to use Native American. I try to use indigenous when I can. Schools here in the United States that would take these young, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids and basically put them in boarding schools to learn how to be upstanding American citizens. And it happened in Canada. We're seeing a lot of that now, where we're seeing what the church did to these innocent people. And a lot of it was in the name of religion and things like that. So what you're seeing is the very beginnings of that. And here in this part, it had already been happening elsewhere. You're seeing the beginnings of that these are the people who are taking the culture and just trying to erase it.
Meanwhile, the Inca themselves didn't actually have a writing system. They instead had this really cool thing called a quipu, a collection of knotted cords of different lengths and colors used to record and convey information. Quipus contained all sorts of numerical information, like dates and events and whatnot, but we still mostly can't decipher them, so it's a mystery. Yeah. Our other information on the Inca comes, again, mostly from the Spanish. So, are the Spanish accounts of these civilizations biased and or more likely to portray things in a more negative or exoticized light? Probably in some cases, yeah. But they're the best we have, so they'll have to do. Mm-hmm. Now that we've got that sorted, let's go one by one and look at some proper history. The Aztec and the Inca are actually relative latecomers to the party, as they really only came along in the centuries immediately prior to the Spanish arrival. Those two are contemporaneous with the Renaissance. So it is super inaccurate to label those two as way ancient like we subconsciously tends to do. The Maya, however, are crazy ancient, but not quite as crazy ancient as the Olmec civilization, the first fancy civilization in all of Mesoamerica, which flourished for 2,000 years between 1500 BC and about 400 AD.
Now, and that's the civilization that we know of having the large colossal heads, who were not 100% sure who they all were, whether they were deities or possibly kings, famous leaders of the Olmec civilization. So,
now that is old. While we have a fair amount of Olmec art and statuary thanks to our old pal archaeology, they're still decently mysterious, which makes sense given how old they are. Slightly less old than the Olmecs is the central Mexican city of Teotihuacan, which is similarly shrouded in mystery and uniquely cool for how huge and well designed it was. Its most famous building, the Pyramid of the Sun, was built in the 1st century AD, but aside from the building remains in the city, we really don't know a lot about it, like who built it or who lived there. The presence of some shattered statues points to evidence of some variety of popular uprising near the end of the city's life, but still, not a lot to go on. Also,
So yeah, I mean, we're you know, if you look at this and you can see this as being as on par with the Great Pyramid Complex in Giza, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the Mississippian culture. We have even, you know, Machu Picchu, and you have these great complexes like this. You have them because, see, the people needed a place to go, and they needed a place to converge, to meet, to do business, to worship, to live. And so they built these complexes, and even the Temple of the Sun, as we're talking about, is even bigger volume-wise and base-wise than the Great Pyramid of Giza.
it might have been a trade empire. Again, we don't really know, but it's big, it's old, it's cool, and it was probably the inspiration for most of the subsequent Mesoamerican culture as we understand it now, so it's worth a mention. Anyway, back to the Maya. Agriculture in the Yucatan Peninsula developed in the 2nd millennium BC, and by about 500 BC they had huge and awesome cities. In the centuries following 250 AD, the Maya were out in full force, building giant monuments covered in writing, connecting cities with trade, and just generally being an awesome civilization.
And there really were two there's classical Mayan, and then there's, I think it's just pre-classical Mayan, and so there's different sources of Mayan. So what you end up having is like it's almost like a golden age. So I don't know if they're gonna mention that, but that'd be kind of cool if they did, because it's actually kind of a different, almost like a cultural shift.
It's impressive because it's just kinda cool, but also because it was really hard to live in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's an exposed coral reef that's basically impossible to farm conventionally, so they had to practice slash and burn agriculture, where they slash down vegetation and then burn it to infuse the soil with enough nutrients to sustain crops for a few years before moving on to another plot of land and letting the old forest regrow. Adding to the trickiness, rivers don't really form in limestone, so the only naturally available sources of water were sinkholes, called cenotes. So a lot of really intricate hydraulic engineering went into making the Yucatan livable. And if that all sounds labor-intensive, it's because it is. It's a minor miracle that the Maya were able to build the kinds of settlements they did with such inhospitable land. So while the Maya spent the centuries between 250 and 900 AD trying not to die of hunger and thirst on a regular basis, they were practicing their religion, which is really interesting in how heavily cyclical.
So, real quick before he gets into the religion, the classic period is the 250 through 900 AD. Prior to that, going back into 2000 BC, or BCE, was the pre-classic period, and that's when they were really developing their culture, really developing who they were, and then the classic period is when they, like he said, they just ballooned and flourished as the Mayan we know today.
It is. They believe that the world went through cycles of creation and destruction, and most of their deities have some hand in the cyclicality of the universe. The Maya also thought that no beginning or end was definite, and that when someone died, they went on a journey through the underworld and the heavens before showing back up on Earth, which may serve to explain why they were so chill with sacrifice. The sacrificing was also predominantly a priestly measure to delay the rebirth of the world and the collapse of the world as they knew it. But while their mythology may have thought that
And that sounds very similar to the Aztec belief that you had to have a certain number of sacrifices to appease certain deities that would not end the world at the 52nd year or the end of the cycle. So that's a very similar idea.
That nothing has an end, history had other plans for the Maya. A series of droughts contributed to a gradual decline of Maya culture in the southern Yucatan Peninsula. Cities were mostly abandoned due to a likely mix of too many people and too little water. In the centuries after, the Maya gravitated towards the northern Yucatan, where water was more consistently available. Cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan became the dominant urban centers in the later centuries. Even still, those cities also gave way in the 12th and 15th centuries respectively, so by the time the Spanish showed up in the 16th century, there wasn't much left to conquer. So that's the Maya for you. Real slow burn on that one.
Yeah, and that's actually a great way to do it. It's like they played the long game. as I like to call it for a lot of things. When you're doing something and it's not going to be an overnight success, it's the long game. You have to play the long game. And that's what they did. Starting at around 2000 BC, before Common Era, so it's BCE, they started their kind of civilization. And it wasn't for 2,200 years or so that they didn't really come into their own as being a very viable, hugely powerful civilization. And then around 950, around the time that the Vikings were ramping up and really tearing through Europe, that's when they kind of started to have their decline. But it was a slow decline too, because it lasted around 600 years or so, because the Spanish did encounter Mayan. They just didn't encounter them at this great height like they did with the Aztecs or the Incas. And that's pretty common. A lot of these cultures will move on and develop other cultural aesthetics. And as he said, drought in certain parts. We know we have records of droughts affecting the Aztec and affecting the Mayan. And a lot of this was attributed to various reasons, and overpopulation will always cause issues like this. We saw that in Europe, and that's why they expanded to the New World when they found it. So,
The Aztec to the northwest had a much faster history. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a series of independent city-states began cropping up around the Texcoco Lake Valley in what is today central Mexico. One such group of people, the Mexica as they called themselves, settled into an island in the middle of the lake.
Yeah, Aztec is more of our term for them. They wouldn't have really called themselves Aztec. They would have called themselves the Mexica. And our term for them, as lumping everything in, is Aztec. And even so, it's just something to consider.
And founded the city of Tenochtitlan in 1325. The city and the culture developed and spread over the next century as trade increased and cultural and religious influence grew. In 1428, the Mexica formed an alliance with two other nearby peoples, and the newfangled Aztec Empire began to expand their territory and conquer their neighbors. This wasn't terribly bothersome for them because their warriors were really skilled. Not only did they conscript all adult males for fighting, but they used warriors from allies and conquered territories too. Plus, their elite jaguar and eagle warriors were especially fearsome. In the course of conquering a majority of southern Mexico, Tenochtitlan, the capital, became only more and more splendid. Much like Venice, the city was an island, and it was dotted with canals in addition to its huge temples. It's been estimated to have been several times as big as contemporary London, approximately the size of late medieval Paris. Yeah, that's big. And I mean, look at it. That is one pretty city. The Aztec also played a game that the Maya were known for, called Pocatoc. The game apparently involved getting a rubber ball into a high hoop without the use of hands or feet. The game was highly ritualized and meant a lot to the people who watched and played it. The end of the game involved some variety of sacrifice, but we're not quite sure who it would have been or for what purpose. Unlike the gradual decline of Maya cities, the Aztecs lasted right up until the Spanish arrived. And since the Aztecs, unlike the Maya, were an empire, that meant that the Aztecs ruled over a lot of people who thought that they were massive knobs. So when Spain showed up and decided to take everything the Aztecs owned, and also their lives, they stoked rebellions among the Aztecs' often annoyed subjects. Uprisings plus smallpox plus guns made for a fairly quick imperial turnover. But while blood was flying everywhere in Mexico...
Yeah, so... And that's a good point, is that the Spanish did have a lot of help from other indigenous groups who wanted to overthrow. And I can't tell you if there was any kind of deals made or if there was any... We do know that some indigenous people did benefit from Spanish conquest, whether they worked with them or not. But in the end, everyone ended up being... Really until the 1800s, everybody was kind of just under Spain's thumb and not living a good life unless you were a Spanish or part of the ruling aristocracy. And so, yeah, it just kind of came like that. And the Mexica kind of were associated as being the rulers of the Aztec Empire. And so there was this disconnect with their own people. And that happens. We see that happen in a lot of cultures, how the ruling class always has a disconnect with the lower class, or what's considered the lower classes, because of how they live and how they, in the rituals that they do. So when you're taking these outlying groups and you're using their own dissatisfaction to your benefit, yeah, you're going to have that that happen. You're going to be able to use them. And that's what the Spanish did, and successfully.
Mexico, there was an interesting debate going on in Spain. See, while genocide definitely happens during the New World's conquest, some people were debating its merits and whether or not it was justified. A guy named Sepulveda argued that the Aztecs were bad because of how much sacrifice they did, and Spain had the moral authority to kill them in retribution. But a guy named De las Casas argued that the Aztecs were their own people with their own ways, and it was...
Now, and De las Casas was probably, like I said, he was there kind of trying to be the voice of reason for a lot of people. You might remember that name. Was a very important name in Spain. There were some contemporaries with Columbus from that family who were not on Columbus's side. They were against Columbus. So they were... This was a family of people who were kind of like more scholarly based and wanting to do things the right way. But at the same time, they were not... They didn't recognize that even their good intentions were causing harm.
Wasn't for Spain to step in and decide what was right and wrong. It's really neat to see what types of arguments each side was providing, as it gives us an interesting insight into the Spanish colonial mindset. The conquistadors are rightly given a lot of flack for all of their conquisting and genociding, but we should recognize that the morality of genocide was at least on their minds. It's a start, right?
No.
With Mexico
No, so conquistador means conqueror, means conquest. So the fact is that these people were coming in, and we've called them, and they call themselves these conquerors. And what they did, the genocide, I would say it's not a start because of the fact that, there was this genocide that was being done, being perpetrated for the allure of gold, this ecstasy of gold, to use the song title, that was driving these people insane to go over to these new world and get the spices and get the land, get the gold, get these riches. And to do so, they ended up killing people. And then they try to justify it by saying, well, they're bad people because they're committing these ritualistic sacrifices. So we're cleansing this land. And in reality, what they were doing was they were just murdering people for theft. Is really what it boiled down to, and it happened. It happened for centuries. Even the atrocities that the Spanish did to the people after they've conquered the land and put these people into servitude and created the cities such as Mexico City, such as Veracruz, but then had these haciendas and ranches. The atrocities that they did afterwards and that were still just as bad as the genocide that they did when they first came over. So there was no lessons learned for centuries.
Covered, let's jump south and talk about the Inca. The Inca Empire began with the once small kingdom of Cusco in the mountains of Peru, and it started expanding in 1438 to ultimately cover much of South America's west coast. Seriously, this thing was huge. It might have even been the world's biggest empire at the time. Even more impressive, it was multi-ethnic, and it incorporated people through diplomacy as well as outright conquest. The Inca government was very specifically formulated and highly efficient, but the Inca, like we said, had no writing. So, well done. If having no writing was tricky, imagine what it was like building huge stone cities on the tops of mountains with no wheels.
Yeah, that's true. The Inca did not have wheels, which is amazing when you think about when they started. But the terraced farming that they perfected was just, even now to this day they use it. It's just amazing that they could do that. The terraced farming, it's just wonderful. And the intricately stacked stones and bricks and the cities and temples that they build and walls and roads where, no machinery, but yet perfectly cut stone that you couldn't even slide a piece of paper through because it just fits so perfect. And I'm not talking about, square. You're talking about shapes and like corners and edges. And it's just, such ingenuity is amazing.
Yeah, the Inca hauled everything up those mountains with llamas and people. If mountainous cities weren't crazy enough on their own, the Inca also had a network of hundreds of suspension bridges made only from woven fibers that ran all across the mountains. Their fiber working was so refined that they could even make seaworthy boats out of it. The Inca infrastructure, which is amazingly well adapted to the mountain-covered coast, is almost...
Yeah, so if you ever look at Kon-Tiki, and it's been disproven, but not disproven. So Kon-Tiki was the experiment from Thor Heyerdahl, I believe it's his last name, and he was a kind of an anthropologist that his biggest experiment was, or his most famous one was called Kon-Tiki, and I think it was done twice, was to show that you can go on these reed boats from Europe to Easter Island, not Europe, I'm sorry, excuse me, from South America, from Peru, I think is where he started. He might have started in Ecuador, but from South America to Easter Island. And kind of to say, well, this is maybe how Easter Island was populated. And we know now that's not the case. That was not how Easter Island was populated. However, he did prove that those reed ships could, in fact, be seaworthy on the Pacific Ocean. And he did another one very similar going from Egypt to the Caribbean. Again, successfully. I think he didn't hit the full way the first time, but he did successfully make it the second time. So he was able to prove that these reed ships that were found in the Inca Empire and in the Egyptian culture were able to traverse large expanses of ocean.
Almost entirely a result of their excellent central government. Terrace farming was also a huge factor in the ability of the Inca to live in such mountainy terrain. Also, in the middle of all this, they figured out how to freeze-dry food, and were also performing consistently successful brain surgery. So there's that.
Now, what we get for the tubers for sweet potatoes and not yams specifically, but sweet potatoes that we have, the variety from, because there's a lot of varieties, but one of the major varieties that we have come from the Inca. So that was a very important crop that was able to be developed in a lot of other parts of the world because of the Inca Empire. And famous corn was also from the New World.
Much like with the Aztecs, the Spanish showed up in the 1500s with intents to wreck shop and colonize everything. And they did. An Incan civil war and the outbreak of smallpox immediately prior to the Spanish arrival certainly made conquering easier for them. In the centuries after, Spain would import tons upon tons of gold and silver from the New World and absolutely destroy their economy with inflation, sending them on a lovely one-way ride to geopolitical irrelevance within a century. I'm not saying karma, but it kinda seems like karma, don't you think?
To start.
Anyway, that's Mesoamerica for you. Maya, Aztec, and Inca. Hey, there we go.
All right, so that was pretty cool. I got on my soapbox a couple times. I'm really passionate just because of my family's background of a lot of this stuff, and then just reading about it myself. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of great history. You could even see it on. There's good documentaries that you can watch on these three civilizations, and there's more to it. Like I said, I mentioned the Nazca. We know about Nazca lines, but there was a culture, the Nazca culture, that was pre-Incan. There were the Olmecs, I know they mentioned, but then you had the Toltec, and you had other civilizations in Mexico prior to the Aztec and contemporaries with Maya even. And, you have a lot of them, even going up northern Mexico where the Apache were building their own culture. What you don't have as much physical evidence of there, but you do have the cultural evidence. But even if you go even further up, you have the Hopi and the Pueblo people, and you have a lot of the, like I said, the Mississippian culture. So there's a lot of great, wonderful civilizations and vibrant cultures here in the Western Hemisphere prior to the Columbian Exchange, what we call the Columbian Exchange, which, if we're honest, we got the worst end of it because they get the gold, silver, good crops, and we got the smallpox and shit like that. Did supply them with syphilis, so that's kind of good, I guess. Whatever. But as I said, there's a lot of history there, and there's just a very vibrant that we don't talk about in the United States education. This is glanced over, or it's given a couple pages in a book. There's a whole wide range of cultures throughout the world that are not Eurocentric, and we need to start celebrating those a lot more, because, as I said, there's a lot of things that would not be in Europe today if it were not for the New World or for even the Asian world. So, all right, that's my soapbox for today. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll check you guys later.